On the surface, the world of Pokémon feels simple. Catch creatures, train them, and rise to become the champion. But beneath the bright colors and familiar battles lies something far stranger. Hidden deep within the code are secret systems, invisible mechanics, and mathematical oddities that shape every encounter in ways most players never notice. These quirks were never meant to be seen, yet they quietly influence everything, from whether your move hits to how a Pokemon grows, evolves, and even bonds with you. Some are brilliant design choices, others are happy accidents, the byproduct of an ambitious world built inside limited hardware. Together, they form a hidden layer of mystery that has kept Pokemon endlessly fascinating for decades. So today, we're diving beneath the surface to uncover the weirdest and most obscure mechanics in Pokemon history, the secrets most trainers never even knew existed. If you love exploring the hidden side of games like this, make sure to subscribe and join us as we uncover more of the mysteries that make Pokemon so much deeper than it seems. One of the strangest bugs buried deep in Pokemon Red and Blue's code is the 1 over 256 accuracy glitch. On the surface, it seems simple. Every move in the game has an accuracy stat. Some, like Swift, are labeled always hit. Others, like Fire Blast or Thunder, show their chances right on the screen. But what most players never realized is that behind the scenes, even the most accurate move can fail, not because of luck, but because of a tiny math error. Here's how it works. Pokemon Red and Blue calculate hit chances using an 8-bit system, which means all values are processed as numbers between 0 and 255. When the game checks whether a move hits, it rolls a random number from 0 to 255 and compares it to the move's accuracy value, also stored in that same range. So a move with 100% accuracy is represented internally as 255 out of 256. If the random number generated happens to land on exactly 255, the very top of the range, the game reads it as a miss. That's a 1 in 256 chance for even a guaranteed hit to fail. It's so rare that many players never notice it, but it's technically possible in every battle. It means that no matter how strong or skilled you are, there's always an invisible sliver of chaos waiting in the background, a reminder that perfection doesn't exist, even in code. This bug persisted, not because developers intended it, but because early Game Boy programming relied heavily on efficient shortcuts, and rounding to 255 was faster than adding an extra line of logic. Over time, it became a quirky part of Pokemon history, a tiny, unseen roll of the dice that makes even certainty uncertain. In the early days of Pokemon, few players realized that speed didn't just decide who moves first, it secretly determined who crits more often. In Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow, the chance for a critical hit wasn't a fixed number, like 6.25% as it is today. Instead, it scaled directly with a Pokemon's base speed stat. The faster your Pokemon was, the more likely it was to land devastating critical hits, often enough to completely break the balance of battles. The formula behind this system is deceptively simple. A Pokemon's base speed is divided by 512 to calculate its critical hit chance. So a Pokemon with 100 base speed has about a 19.5% crit rate, while one with 50 base speed has just 9.7%. Some Pokémon, like Persian, with its 115 base speed and access to the move Slash, which was flagged as a high critical hit rate move, had their crit chance doubled, giving them over a 40% chance to land a critical every time they attacked. This meant that quick Pokémon weren't just faster, they were statistically deadlier. A nimble Persian or Jolteon could slice through slower tanks with critical hits that ignored defense boosts and doubled damage output. Meanwhile, slower powerhouses like Onix or Machamp were doomed to hit hard but rarely land a critical blow. The mechanic wasn't explained anywhere in-game, leaving generations of players confused about why certain Pokémon seemed luckier than others. It wasn't until fans began dissecting the game's code that this hidden formula was discovered. Later generations would change the system to a flat chance for everyone, making battles more predictable, but the Jindal Eye system remains one of the most fascinating examples of how invisible math could define the feel of an entire generation. Focus energy was designed to make a Pokémon more likely to land critical hits, a simple, exciting idea that fit perfectly into the rhythm of battle. But in Pokémon Red and Blue, this mechanic is famously broken. Instead of raising your odds of landing a critical hit, it actually makes them worse. The bug was so subtle that players didn't realize for years why their focus energy users seemed to perform worse instead of better. The mistake happened deep within the game's code. When focus energy is used, the game multiplies a Pokémon's critical hit chance by 4. However, due to a programming error, the calculation divides the chance instead of multiplying it, cutting your odds by a factor of 4 rather than boosting them. So if your Pokémon originally had a 20% chance to crit, using focus energy dropped it down to around 5%. This inversion makes focus energy one of the most counterproductive moves in the entire series, a move that sabotages the player while pretending to help. The bug remained unnoticed during development, likely because testing battles were done under limited conditions, and critical hits are random enough that the lowered rate wasn't immediately obvious. For players who relied on strategy guides or in-game move descriptions, focus energy became a cruel trick. They'd use it to set up a big critical hit sweep, only to find themselves landing fewer than ever. Later generations would fix the problem, restoring focus energy's original purpose. But in Gen I, it stands as one of the most famous examples of Pokémon's messy early code, a reminder that even the simplest mechanics can hide unexpected flaws. The badge boost glitch is another one of those invisible quirks that makes Gen I battles behave in ways players never expected. In Pokémon Red and Blue, every time you earn a gym badge, your Pokémon's stats receive small permanent boosts: attack, speed, defense, and so on, depending on which badge you earned. That part works as intended, but hidden beneath that, the game contains an unintentional quirk that allows these badge boosts to be reapplied mid-battle whenever a stat change occurs. Here's how it works. When any of your Pokemon's stats are altered, say you use Swords Dance or Tail Whip, or even if an opponent lowers your stats, the game recalculates all your current stats. But instead of just reapplying the temporary stat changes, it also reapplies all the badge boosts again, stacking them on top of the old ones. So each time your stats are updated, your Pokemon gets stronger, faster, or tougher than it should be. This means moves that change stats, even slightly, can accidentally supercharge your Pokémon far beyond intended limits. For example, if your Pokémon has earned the Thunder Badge, which boosts speed, and you use Agility during battle, that speed bonus gets reapplied again, effectively multiplying the effect. Competitive players discovered that this glitch could be exploited to create unstoppable teams, where a few status changes turned already powerful Pokémon into monsters. The developers never intended for badges to interact this way, but because of how the stat calculation code was structured, the bug persisted. Later generations fixed the oversight, separating permanent badge bonuses from temporary stat effects. But in the original games, it remains one of the most famous pieces of unintentional strategy, a secret edge hiding inside Kanto's most nostalgic battles. In Generation 1, a handful of moves, Wrap, Bind, Clamp, and Fire Spin, were meant to simulate holding an opponent in place, trapping them in continuous damage over several turns. But the way these partial trapping moves were coded made them far more powerful than anyone expected. Instead of just dealing chip damage and restricting switching, these moves could completely lock an opponent out of acting, effectively freezing them in time until the attack ended. When a Pokémon used one of these moves, it dealt a small amount of damage each turn for several turns. That part was intended. But the problem came from how the turn system worked in Pokémon Red and Blue. While the move was active, the trapped Pokémon couldn't select or use any moves, meaning it was forced to sit idle while damage continued to tick down. Even worse, the trapping Pokémon could attack again before the opponent ever got a turn back, allowing the cycle to repeat indefinitely. In practice, this meant a Pokémon like Dragonite using Wrap or Tentacruel using Clamp could completely lock an opponent into helplessness for the entire fight. If the initial hit landed, the victim might never move again until it fainted. This made these moves devastatingly effective, especially when paired with speed advantages or accuracy manipulation. Later generations would rework the mechanic entirely. Starting in Generation 2, trapped Pokémon could still attack during the effect, and the duration was shortened to a predictable few turns. But in the original games, partial trapping wasn't just a strategy, it was practically a form of soft locking your opponent. Many competitive players banned or avoided these moves altogether because of how unfair and frustrating they were. It was one of those early examples of how Pokemon's simple battle engine could accidentally create nightmarishly powerful loops. Hyper Beam was one of the flashiest and strongest moves in the original Pokemon games. With an incredible base power of 150, it easily outclassed almost every other normal type attack. The move's one big drawback was supposed to be its recharge turn. After using it, your Pokemon had to rest, leaving itself open to counterattacks. But in Generation 1, a hidden quirk in the code made that downside vanish entirely under one specific condition. If Hyper Beam knocked out the opponent, you didn't have to recharge at all. This oversight meant that if you used Hyper Beam to score a KO, your Pokemon was immediately ready to act again on the next turn. The recharge penalty simply never triggered. That gave the move a devastating snowball effect. A strong Pokemon like Tauros or Dragonite could chain Hyper Beams turn after turn, wiping out entire teams if each hit resulted in a knockout. Theoretically, As long as every hyper beam defeated its target, you could sweep without ever suffering the intended cooldown. The reason for this glitch lies in the turn order processing. When a Pokémon faints, the game immediately ends the round before reaching the point where it flags the user as recharging. So the condition to enforce the delay never activates. Later versions of Pokémon fixed this by checking whether Hyper Beam had been used, regardless of whether an opponent fainted. Back in the red and blue days, however, this loophole made Hyper Beam a favorite among competitive players. It transformed from a risky finisher into one of the most reliable win conditions in the game. What was meant to be a dramatic, high-stakes move became an unstoppable chain reaction of power, the kind of accidental imbalance that helped give early Pokémon battles their unpredictable charm. In Generation 1, Counter was one of those mysterious moves that sounded simple on paper but worked in baffling ways. The in-game description said it returns double the damage taken from a physical attack, leading players to believe it would reflect any non-special hit. But in Pokémon Red and Blue, the actual code behind Counter behaves in a much stranger, more restrictive way. It doesn't respond to physical moves at all. Instead, it only reflects attacks that meet a very specific, hidden condition. The move must deal normal or fighting type damage and must be processed by the game's physical damage formula. Because of this narrow definition, Counter only works against a handful of moves, things like Body Slam, Karate Chop, or Tackle. Try to use it against a move like Earthquake or Rock Slide, and it simply fails, even though those are also physical attacks. The code doesn't check the move category like later games do. It checks a memory slot that holds the last move's damage variable. If the last attack doesn't fit its internal filter, Counter just does nothing. Even stranger, Counter doesn't always target the right opponent in double or trainer battles because it looks at specific memory addresses rather than the actual Pokémon that attacked. This can lead to weird edge cases where Counter reflects damage that came from the wrong source or from no one at all. For players in the 1990s, Counter was one of those moves that seemed unpredictable, sometimes devastating, other times completely useless. It wasn't until fans started reading the game's code that the logic behind it became clear. Later generations rewrote Counter entirely to make it behave as originally intended, but in the original games, it was a quirky, semi-broken mechanic that rewarded understanding the code more than understanding the battle. Substitute is one of the most iconic moves in Pokémon, a clever bit of design that lets your Pokémon sacrifice some of its HP to create a decoy that absorbs damage and blocks status effects. On the surface, it's a straightforward concept. Create a dummy, protect yourself for a few turns. But in the original Pokémon Red and Blue, Substitute didn't quite work as cleanly as players assumed. The move's interactions with other mechanics reveal a web of exceptions and loopholes that make it as unpredictable as it is useful. When you use Substitute, your Pokémon loses 1/4 of its maximum HP to create a copy that takes hits in its place. This copy blocks most damaging attacks until it breaks and also stops many status effects, such as sleep, paralysis, or poison. However, it doesn't block everything, and the things that slip through can be surprising. For example, attacks that cause confusion or stat drops can still affect the user directly, even when the substitute is up. Likewise, certain secondary effects, like recoil or leech life drain, still apply behind a substitute, depending on how the game processes the move. In Generation 1, the system is particularly inconsistent because of how the code distinguishes between status effects and side effects. The substitute protects against direct status changes like Thunder Wave, but it doesn't stop effects triggered after damage calculation. This means that even though you appear protected, moves like Hyper Beam can still force you to recharge after hitting the substitute. Despite these oddities, Substitute became one of the most strategic tools in Pokemon battles, especially when paired with setup moves or status inducers. Players could use it to safely scout an opponent's moves or stall while waiting for poison damage to accumulate. The move's strange internal logic, what it blocks and what it doesn't, makes it one of the clearest examples of how Pokemon's battle system evolved from clever improvisation into precise design. In Gen I, it's not just a shield, it's a window into how the game's invisible rules sometimes contradict its visible ones. Struggle is one of those moves that most players never plan to use, yet it's quietly one of the most important mechanics in Pokemon. It only appears when a Pokemon has completely run out of PP for all its moves, a rare situation that usually means you've been fighting for far too long. In Pokemon Red and Blue, this desperate state triggers an automatic attack called Struggle, a weak move that damages both the opponent and the user. But what's fascinating is how this simple backup mechanic behaves under the hood, and how its recoil can create some of the strangest outcomes in battle. In Generation 1, Struggle is classified as a normal type move with a base power of 50. It always hits, regardless of accuracy checks, and ignores type immunity, meaning even ghost types can be struck by it, despite being normally immune to normal attacks. After dealing damage, a Struggle inflicts recoil equal to 25% of the damage dealt, often fainting the user if their HP is low. But because of how the damage calculation works, this recoil can interact with fainting order in strange ways. If both Pokemon faint on the same turn due to Struggle recoil, the game determines the winner based on who fainted first in the code's internal order, not what the player sees on screen. This can lead to situations where you appear to faint last but still lose, or vice versa. It's a tiny quirk that's decided countless long, drawn-out matches, especially when both sides are left with no PP. Later games redefined Struggle to deal typeless damage and altered how recoil worked, but its legacy remains. It's the ultimate last resort move, one that captures the desperation of an exhausted Pokemon giving everything it has left, even if it costs its own life in the process. In modern Pokemon, training a balanced team often involves managing effort values, EVLS, specific stat boosts gained from battling certain opponents. But back in Pokemon Red, Blue, and even Gold and Silver, the system worked completely differently. Instead of having separate EV caps for each stat, the early games used something called stat experience, a hidden system that allowed Pokemon to improve every stat simply by fighting more battles. Every time your Pokemon defeated an opponent, it gained invisible points based on that enemy's base stats. For example, beating a Machop would increase your attack stat experience, while defeating a Pidgey might raise speed. There were no limits, every stat could theoretically be maxed out by fighting long enough. This meant that if you played through the game naturally, your Pokemon would grow well-rounded. But for competitive players or min-maxers, it opened up strange possibilities. With enough time, a single Pokemon could max out every stat, becoming incredibly powerful in all areas. There was no specialization or trade-off, just endless grinding for incremental growth. This system also made the rare candy method weaker, since Pokemon that leveled up without battling missed out on valuable stat experience. It rewarded constant fighting and punished shortcuts. The idea was ambitious but unwieldy. The hidden numbers behind it were so opaque that most players never realized why their Pokemon's stats seemed to grow inconsistently. You could play two identical Pokemon to the same level and end up with different results simply based on what they had fought. When Generation 3 arrived, the developers replaced stat experience with the more structured EV system we know today, which capped total stat growth and made specialization possible. Still, the old stat experience system remains an intriguing piece of design history, a relic from when Pokemon's growth was less about strategy and more about persistence, reflecting a time when the grind itself was part of the adventure. Confusion is one of those status effects that feels simple during battle. Your Pokemon becomes dizzy, and sometimes it hurts itself instead of attacking. But under the surface, the mechanic is far more complex than most players ever realize. In Generation 1, the damage your Pokemon takes when it hits itself in confusion isn't random. It's actually a calculated attack using your own stats against yourself. The game treats a confusion self-hit as a 40-power typeless physical move, one that uses your own attack stat to determine damage and your own defense stat to mitigate it. This setup means that buffs and debuffs directly influence how much self-inflicted pain you suffer. If you've used Swords Dance to raise your attack, for instance, your confusion damage skyrockets. Likewise, if your opponent has lowered your defense, you'll hurt yourself even more. The opposite is true as well. If your attack is weakened, confusion damage drops, and if you've raised your defense, you take less. This hidden relationship makes confusion one of the few random effects that still rewards careful stat management. What's stranger is how the damage calculation doesn't check for type advantages or resistances, since the move is considered typeless. No Pokemon has any immunity to it, and it always uses physical damage, regardless of whether the Pokemon is normally a special attacker. So a fragile special attacker, like Alakazam, can end up knocking itself out in one unlucky turn if its attack stat happens to be high enough, or if its HP is low. Later generations preserved this core logic, keeping confusion as a psychological mirror, your Pokemon literally turning its own strength against itself. It's a cruel but elegant bit of game design, reminding players that sometimes the greatest threat in a battle isn't your opponent. It's your own power reflected back at you. Burn is one of Pokemon's oldest and most punishing status conditions, and in the early generations, it had a devastating hidden side effect. It cut the user's attack stat in half. This single mechanic quietly defined generations of competitive play, completely changing how physical attackers were used and how valuable certain support moves became. In Pokémon Red and Blue, a burn did two things. It inflicted a small amount of damage at the end of each turn, and it applied an invisible multiplier that reduced the Pokemon's attack stat by 50%. That meant even after healing the HP loss, the Pokemon's damage output stayed crippled until the burn was cured. For offensive physical sweepers like Machamp, Persian, or Snorlax, being burned was essentially a death sentence. They could still act, but their blows became pitifully weak, often turning the tide of battle instantly. This design decision was intentional. Game Freak wanted status effects to represent meaningful consequences rather than minor annoyances, and burn served as the counterpart to paralysis. Where paralysis slowed you down, burn stole your strength. It forced players to think beyond brute force, encouraging status management, support Pokémon, and items like full heal. The attack halving effect remained consistent all the way through Generation 6, shaping decades of strategy. It made moves like Will-O-Wisp incredibly powerful, as it could completely shut down physical threats with a single hit. Burn became one of the most feared and respected conditions in the series. It wasn't until Generation 7 that the developers finally toned it down, reducing the attack penalty to 0.5 times total damage instead of 0.5 times attack stat, making the effect easier to balance. But for over 20 years, Burn was a silent executioner, an invisible debuff that could turn even the strongest Pokémon into harmless shadows of themselves. It remains one of the clearest examples of how a single hidden multiplier can completely alter the flow of battle. In the earliest generations of Pokémon, sleep was one of the most dreaded status effects, not because it was flashy or damaging, but because it quietly robbed players of control in the most punishing way possible. Unlike later games, where waking up allows your Pokémon to act immediately, Generation 1's sleep mechanics were designed to make you feel helpless. When a Pokémon woke up, it didn't attack right away. Instead, it spent that turn doing nothing, effectively wasting an action. That one small design choice made sleep devastating. Even if your Pokémon had technically recovered, the opponent still got a free hit before you could move again. It transformed sleep-inducing moves like Hypnosis, Sing, and Sleep Powder into game-breaking tools. Trainers could lock opponents into endless cycles of re-sleeping before they ever had a chance to strike back. Combined with the limited availability of items during battles and the absence of abilities like Insomnia or Vital Spirit, being put to sleep could spell disaster. In competitive play, this created the infamous sleep clause, an unofficial rule that banned players from putting more than one Pokémon to sleep at a time to keep matches from devolving into endless sleep loops. Without that rule, the game's flow could grind to a halt. One bad coin flip, and your team might never recover. Later generations adjusted this mechanic, letting Pokémon act immediately after waking up, and eventually reducing the overall sleep duration to keep battles more balanced. But the legacy of Gen E's system still lingers in player memory. Sleep wasn't just a status condition, it was a tactical prison, a silent countdown that made you watch helplessly as your opponent dismantled your team one turn at a time. If sleep was a soft lock, then freeze was an absolute one. In the original Pokémon Red and Blue, the freeze status was arguably the most brutal condition in the entire game, not because it dealt extra damage or reduced your stats, but because it effectively ended your Pokémon's usefulness forever. Once frozen, a Pokémon could not move, act, or thaw out naturally. It remained encased in ice indefinitely until one of two very specific things happened. You used an item to cure it, or your opponent hit you with a fire type attack that thawed you out. That meant a single lucky ice beam or blizzard could permanently remove a Pokemon from battle. In many cases, the game was as good as over the moment freeze landed. You could switch out, but the frozen Pokemon would remain unusable until you manually healed it with an ice heal or full restore. Since battles in the 1990s often had limited access to healing items mid-fight, a frozen Pokemon might as well have been fainted. This wasn't a programming mistake. It was a deliberate, if cruel, design choice meant to make status conditions feel consequential. But it also made freeze notoriously unbalanced, since the only counterplay was pure luck or preparation. Competitive matches often turned into tense stalemates, where players prayed not to be frozen by blizzard, especially since the move had high accuracy and a 10% freeze chance in Gen I. Later generations softened the mechanic considerably. Starting in Generation 2, frozen Pokemon could thaw out on their own over time, and moves that interacted with heat could speed up the process. Modern games even renamed the condition to Frozen Solid, emphasizing its temporary nature. Still, nothing compares to the cold cruelty of Gen Ui's freeze. It wasn't just a setback, it was a silent death sentence, a chilling reminder that in early Pokemon, even luck could feel like destiny. In theory, one of the biggest counters to psychic types in the original Pokemon games was supposed to be ghost types. The game's type chart, shown in guides and hinted at in dialogue, clearly said that Ghost is super effective against Psychic. This was meant to balance out Psychic Pokemon like Alakazam and Starmie, which dominated the early meta with their high speed and special stats. But due to a single error in the code, that balance never actually worked. In Pokemon Red and Blue, Ghost-type moves simply don't affect Psychic types at all. This bug stems from a misconfigured type effectiveness table buried deep in the game's data. The developers accidentally set the multiplier for Ghost versus Psychic to 0 instead of super effective. As a result, when a move like Lick or Nightshade hits a Psychic Pokemon, the game reads the result as no effect, just like trying to hit a Ghost with normal type attacks. The intended weakness, one that was supposed to give players a tool against the overpowered Psychic class, was completely nullified. To make matters worse, Ghost types themselves weren't much help, even without the bug. The only Ghost Pokemon available in Generation 1 were Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar, all of which were part Poison type, making them weak to Psychic moves. The combination of a broken type interaction and poor defensive typing turned what was meant to be a counter matchup into a lopsided disaster. This coding mistake, combined with the already overpowered special stat system, cemented Psychic types as the undisputed kings of the Kanto region. It wasn't until later generations that Ghost attacks finally started working properly against Psychic Pokemon, restoring the balance that was supposed to exist from the beginning. But by then, the legend of Gen Nu's broken Psychic dominance was already carved into Pokemon history. Among all the strange oddities in Pokemon Red and Blue, few are as amusing or as illustrative of early programming limitations as Karate Chop. At first glance, it seems like a straightforward move, a signature fighting type attack used by Pokemon like Machop and Mankey. But in the game's actual data, Karate Chop isn't fighting type at all. It's coded as normal type, completely breaking the logic of how it's supposed to work. This mistake meant that when players used Karate Chop against rock, steel, or ghost type Pokemon, it behaved in bizarre and unintended ways. It didn't deal the expected super effective damage against rock types, nor did it interact properly with ghost types. In fact, Karate Chop was effectively useless against the very opponents it was meant to counter. The reason behind this lies in the game's internal move index. Early in development, Karate Chop was assigned a placeholder type, normal, likely because the developers hadn't finalized the fighting type move list yet. When the game shipped, that placeholder value was never corrected. This made Karate Chop a kind of fake fighting move, one that looked right on the surface but didn't behave that way at all. What's even funnier is that Karate Chop still benefited from fighting type Pokemon's same type attack bonus, STAB, so a Machop could hit slightly harder with it, even though the move's type was technically wrong. This mismatch went unnoticed by many casual players, but once data miners began dissecting the ROM decades later, it became one of the most famous examples of early Pokemon's messy but charming code. The error was eventually fixed in later generations, where Karate Chop properly became a fighting type move. Still, it remains a nostalgic reminder of Pokemon's humble beginnings, when even the most basic attacks could carry hidden secrets in their binary DNA. One of the most quietly important systems in Pokemon's battle mechanics, and one that most players rarely think about, is the damage randomizer. Every time an attack lands, the game doesn't just calculate a flat number based on stats and type effectiveness. It introduces a hidden element of chance. In every generation since the very first, Pokemon damage rolls within a built-in random range, usually between 85% and 100% of the move's full potential damage. That small margin, only a 15% swing, might sound minor, but it has changed the outcome of countless battles over the years. In Generation 1, this random range was handled by a simple multiplier in the damage formula that picked a number between 217 and 255 out of 255 possible values, then divided it by 255. The result? Even perfectly calculated attacks could either barely fail to knock out a foe or miraculously finish the job with a few points to spare. This mechanic serves an important role in game design. It prevents every battle from being purely deterministic, keeping combat unpredictable and dynamic. No matter how well you've planned your strategy, there's always a sliver of luck involved, a bit of tension that makes every hit matter. But in the early days, it also created confusion. Players trying to math out damage thresholds found that their calculations didn't always hold up. A move that had KO'd a Pokemon before might leave it hanging on with a few HP the next time. Competitive players learned to respect the roll. They coined phrases like low roll and high roll to describe these near misses and lucky hits, turning the invisible math into part of the game's shared language. Even now, that hidden 15% of uncertainty ensures that no battle ever feels completely safe or completely lost until the final pixel of HP disappears. If the damage randomizer is Pokemon's subtle chaos engine, Protect and detect are the opposite, tools of deliberate control. Introduced to give defensive strategies breathing room, these moves create a one-turn shield that blocks nearly every form of attack, letting players stall for poison damage, scout opponents' moves, or simply waste a turn. But hidden within their design is an ingenious limiter that keeps them from becoming unstoppable: the success decay system. When you use protect or detect once, it has a 100% chance to succeed. Your Pokémon raises its guard perfectly, nullifying everything from Hyper Beam to Explosion. But if you try to use it again immediately, the success rate drops dramatically to 50%, then 25%, and eventually as low as 12.5% for each consecutive use. This exponential decay ensures that players can't hide behind infinite shields, forcing them to think carefully about when to use these life-saving turns. The underlying mechanic works through a hidden counter that tracks consecutive successful uses of any protective move, not just protect or detect, but also similar effects like endure. Each time the move works, the success rate is halved for the next attempt. This penalty only resets once the Pokémon performs a different action. What's clever about this system is how it subtly enforces balance while maintaining the illusion of freedom. Players can gamble with repeated protects, and sometimes that 25% miracle can turn the tide of battle. But more often, it punishes predictability, rewarding those who vary their strategy instead of relying on stalling alone. Over the years, protect and detect have become cornerstones of competitive play, shaping strategies from doubles teams to toxic stall builds. Yet their internal decay mechanic remains one of the least understood features among casual players. What seems like a simple move, block all damage this turn, hides a deeply considered rule that turns a shield into a calculated risk. It's a reminder that in Pokémon, even defense is a game of probabilities, not guarantees. Encore is one of those deceptively simple moves that completely changes how a battle unfolds. At first glance, it just forces the opponent to repeat their last move for a few turns, but in practice, it's one of the most psychologically and strategically devastating tools in the Pokémon series. First introduced in Generation 2, Encore manipulates the flow of combat by turning an opponent's choice, one of the few freedoms they have, into a prison. Here's how it works. When a Pokémon is hit by Encore, it becomes locked into using the move it just performed, forced to repeat it for 2 to 6 turns, later standardized to 3. That might not sound too bad if the move was an attack like Thunderbolt or Flamethrower, but if the opponent used a setup move like Swords Dance, Substitute, or even a useless support move like Splash or Protect, Encore turns those actions into dead buttons, leaving them helpless while you capitalize on their mistake. The move's power lies not in damage, but in timing. Skilled players use Encore to trap opponents mid-setup or mid-defense, forcing them to waste turns and giving free openings for counters or switches. In doubles battles, it's especially lethal. One partner can bait a defensive move while the other locks it in, creating complete battlefield control. Encore also punishes overconfidence. Many players have lost entire matches after setting up one too many boosts, only to get caught and forced to spam a non-damaging move while the opponent dismantled their team. Over the years, the mechanic has been fine-tuned, the duration reduced, and some immunities added, but the essence remains the same. Encore doesn't just stop an opponent from acting freely, it takes the very concept of strategy and turns it against them, freezing time mid-battle. If Encore is a move about control, Pursuit is about punishment, a mechanic built to catch opponents right in the act of retreating. Introduced in Generation 2, Pursuit is one of the few moves in Pokémon that changes its behavior entirely based on your opponent's decision. Normally, it's a modest Dark-type attack with 40 base power, but if the opponent tries to switch out on the same turn, Pursuit triggers before the switch happens, striking them mid-escape and doubling in power to 80. This made Pursuit a game changer in both casual play and high-level competition. Suddenly, switching, one of Pokemon's most fundamental defensive tools, became risky. Trainers had to think twice before recalling their weakened Psychic or Ghost-type Pokemon, knowing that an ambush could be waiting. In fact, Pursuit became so synonymous with Psychic hunting that it shaped entire team compositions during the Gen 2 and Gen 3 metagames. What made it brilliant was how it exploited the battle system's timing rules. Normally, switching occurs before most attacks resolve, but Pursuit interrupts that order, striking at the exact moment of retreat. This allowed it to KO fleeing Pokémon before they could escape, preventing strategies like pivot switching or baton passing with low HP. In essence, Pursuit punished prediction and rewarded it at the same time. Players often built entire cores around Pursuit users, like Tyranitar, Scizor, or Weevil, who could trap and eliminate key threats like Alakazam or Gengar with surgical precision. It added a layer of fear and mind games that made switching, something as simple as pressing run, feel dangerous. By Generation 8, Pursuit was quietly removed from the mainline games, a victim of balance cleanup. Yet its absence left a hole in the meta. Pursuit wasn't just a move, it was a statement. It reminded players that in Pokémon, even retreat has consequences, and sometimes running only makes the hit hurt more. When U-Turn debuted in Generation 4, it quietly redefined the entire concept of momentum in Pokémon battles. At first glance, it's just a physical bug-type move. It deals damage, then lets your Pokémon switch out. But what makes U-Turn and its special counterpart Volt Switch revolutionary is that it flips the normal sequence of switching on its head. Instead of switching before attacking like a standard retreat, these moves strike first and then pivot out, letting the player both deal damage and reposition in a single, seamless turn. This mechanic changed the tempo of competitive play. Suddenly, teams could maintain near constant control over the battlefield, keeping pressure on opponents without ever staying in one place for long. Using U-Turn or Volt Switch, a trainer could safely scout an opponent's switch, punish it, and immediately send in the best counter, all while chipping away at health. It was the birth of what competitive players now call momentum-based play. Pokémon like Scizor, Landorus T, and Rotom W became legendary, not just for their stats, but for how they abused these moves to stay one step ahead. A well-timed U-turn let them escape bad matchups, break focus sashes, and pivot into favorable positions. The result was an entire strategy archetype known as Volt Turn, where teams chained these moves back to back to keep the opponent perpetually reacting instead of acting. From a design standpoint, U-Turn and Volt Switch are brilliant examples of mechanical evolution. They merge offense and defense into one elegant command. No longer were players forced to choose between attacking and switching. They could do both. It's a system that rewards prediction, punishes hesitation, and embodies the idea that in Pokémon, momentum is everything. Before its restrictions, Baton Pass was one of the most abusable and fascinating mechanics in Pokémon history. Introduced in Generation 2, its premise sounded simple: switch out your Pokémon while passing along certain effects. But that certain effects clause ended up encompassing nearly everything that mattered. Stat boosts from moves like Swords Dance or Agility? Passed. Substitutes? Passed. Even rare conditions like Ingrain or Aqua Ring could carry over. In the hands of clever players, this single move became a bridge between entire strategies. The idea was that Baton Pass represented trust, a Pokémon handing off its accumulated strength to the next ally. But players quickly discovered that it could break the balance of battle. Entire teams were built around one goal: stacking as many stat boosts as possible and then passing them to a powerful finisher like Espeon, Vaporeon, or Smeargle. Known as Baton Pass chains, these strategies could make unstoppable monsters that outsped and outpowered everything on the field. The core of the mechanic's power lay in how inclusive it was. Nearly every positive change, from evasion boosts to substitute shields, would transfer seamlessly, letting players carry forward turn after turn of progress. In competitive formats, this led to frustration as matches turned into long, one-sided setups that few teams could counter once momentum started rolling. Eventually, developers and competitive leagues introduced restrictions. The most significant came in Generation 6 and 7, where rules were implemented to prevent passing certain combinations of boosts, particularly speed and other stats, together. Smogon, the fan-run competitive hub, even went further, banning Baton Pass chains entirely. Yet despite its reputation as a broken move, Baton Pass remains one of the most symbolically rich mechanics in the series. It captures the spirit of teamwork, one Pokémon sacrificing its moment to empower another. When used responsibly, it's elegant. When abused, it's terrifying. And that delicate balance between cooperation and chaos is exactly what makes Baton Pass one of Pokemon's most legendary and controversial moves. In Pokemon battles, most players think speed is the ultimate decider. The faster Pokemon moves first, right? But buried deep in the battle system lies a hidden hierarchy that can override that entire logic: priority brackets. These determine move order before speed ever comes into play. Each move in the series has an assigned priority value, usually ranging from -7 to +5. A move like Quick Attack, for example, has +1 priority, meaning it always acts before any move with 0 priority, no matter how slow the Pokemon using it is. Conversely, moves like Roar or Trick Room have negative priority, forcing them to go last. This invisible structure is what makes priority such a critical and often underestimated layer of Pokemon strategy. A frail but quick Pokemon might rely on raw speed, but a slower one with a strong priority move can easily outmaneuver it. For instance, Sizer's Bullet Punch or Azumaril's Aqua Jet lets them punch above their speed tier, often turning what would be a losing matchup into a surprise knockout. The system also allows complex interactions when multiple priority moves clash. If two moves share the same priority value, only then does speed determine who acts first. This is why mirror matches, say two sizers both using bullet punch, still come down to which one's faster. But if one of them uses a +2 move, like extreme speed, it cuts in line entirely, regardless of speed stats. Priority brackets represent one of the most elegant examples of balance in Pokemon's design. They give slower Pokemon a fighting chance and force players to think beyond raw speed. It's not just who's faster, it's who acts first when it counts. And yet, there's one move that flips this entire logic upside down: Trick Room. Trick Room is one of the strangest and most ingenious mechanics in the series, introduced in Generation 4 as a deliberate inversion of Pokemon's most sacred rule: faster Pokemon move first. When Trick Room is active, that logic reverses. Suddenly, the slowest Pokemon on the field become the fastest, and traditional speedsters are forced to sit back and wait their turn. The way it works is subtle but brilliant. Trick Room, a psychic-type move with -7 priority, always goes last on the turn it's used, meaning every other action happens before it takes effect. But once it's active, it creates a field condition that lasts 5 turns, flipping the speed order for every Pokemon on the field. From that moment, a Pokemon with 30 base speed will outspeed one with 130, as long as no priority moves are involved. This one mechanic gave rise to an entire archetype of teams known as Trick Room teams, which intentionally use Pokemon with abysmally low speed but high attack, or special attack. Creatures like Reuniclus, Rhyperior, and Torkoal became powerhouses under Trick Room, turning their sluggishness into a weapon. Trainers learned to use bulky setters to safely activate the move, then send in devastating slow attackers to sweep. But Trick Room doesn't override priority. That's what makes it so interesting. Moves like Quick Attack or Extreme Speed still take precedence, regardless of how slow their user is. This creates layered interactions where both systems, priority and reversed speed, coexist, forcing players to predict not just who's faster, but which rules apply this turn. In essence, Trick Room is Pokemon's ultimate act of subversion. It turns weakness into strength, forcing even experienced players to rewire their instincts. Every battle under Trick Room feels just a little disorienting, a reminder that in Pokemon, speed isn't always what it seems. In standard Pokemon battles, speed determines turn order at the start of each round. But in doubles, where 4 Pokemon act in the same turn and many abilities can alter stats mid-action, the system becomes far more complex. Mid-turn speed changes are one of the most fascinating and often overlooked quirks of the battle engine. They can completely reorder who moves next, even halfway through a turn. In earlier generations, speed order was calculated once at the start of a turn and remained fixed until all actions completed. But starting in Generation 5, the developers quietly changed this rule, and it fundamentally reshaped Double's strategy. Now, if a Pokemon's speed changes mid-turn, say from using Tailwind, Icy Wind, or Suffering Paralysis, the game immediately recalculates the order for the remaining moves. This means that a Pokemon can begin the turn faster than its opponent, use a move that lowers its own speed, and then end up slower before the next Pokemon acts. Or conversely, a slower Pokemon benefiting from an ally's Tailwind might suddenly leap ahead mid-round, interrupting what players assumed would happen next. These dynamic recalculations make doubles battles unpredictable and highly tactical. A perfect example of this is prankster Whimsicott using Tailwind early in the turn. Because Tailwind boosts the team's speed instantly, all remaining allies can move earlier within the same turn. Similarly, abilities like Chlorophyll or Swift Swim can trigger when weather changes mid-round, instantly altering who moves next. This system rewards players who think several actions ahead, those who can anticipate when the speed ladder will shift. In doubles, where every turn is a careful dance of positioning, mid-turn speed changes are the invisible rhythm that separates reactive play from true mastery. While speed changes shape the rhythm of battle, weather shapes the battlefield itself, and it, too, has evolved dramatically across generations. Classic weather mechanics, especially from generations 3 and 4, were once some of the most oppressive and universal effects in the series. When sandstorm or hail activated, they weren't just background visuals. They were constant sources of chip damage, accuracy modifiers, and sweeping stat boosts that could define entire teams. Back then, setting weather often meant controlling the entire match. Abilities like Sandstream, Tyranitar, or Drought Gruden made their effects permanent, lasting until another weather replaced them. This meant that if you led with Tyranitar, your opponent had to play the entire battle under sand unless they brought their own weather setter. The residual chip damage from sandstorm and hail punished every non-resistant Pokémon, slowly grinding them down turn by turn. Even more impactful was how weather interacted with accuracy and move power. Rain boosted water moves by 50% and made thunder never miss, while sun weakened water but made solar beam instant. It wasn't just environmental flavor, it was domination. Competitive metas of the time were built around controlling weather cycles, with entire teams designed as rain teams or sun teams. However, this power came at a cost to variety. Matches often devolved into who could win the weather war, as permanent effects left little room for counterplay. Starting in Generation 6, Game Freak rebalanced weather by giving all non-primal weather effects a strict 5-turn limit, 8 with a damp or heat rock. This single change completely reshaped competitive Pokémon. Weather became a tactical tool rather than a permanent battlefield condition, encouraging smarter timing and team support rather than blind control. Even so, the spirit of the classic weather wars remains legendary. Those endless sandstorms and rain-soaked arenas weren't just effects, they were identity-defining mechanics. They made the battlefield itself an opponent, reminding players that in Pokémon, sometimes the environment is just as deadly as your rival. Few mechanics in Pokémon have sparked as much controversy as Sand Veil and Snow Cloak, abilities that increase a Pokémon's evasion during sandstorms and hailstorms, respectively. On paper, they sound minor, a small 20% boost to evasion when the weather matches. In practice, though, they turned battles into lotteries. A single missed move at a critical moment could flip an entire match, transforming what should have been a tactical contest into a roll of the dice. Introduced in Generation 3, these abilities were meant to give Pokémon adapted to harsh climates a defensive edge. Garchomp, one of the most infamous users of Sand Veil, became the face of the controversy. In permanent sandstorm metas of the time, Its evasion boost often meant that crucial ice beams or dragon claws simply missed, letting it sweep unpunished. The effect wasn't flashy, no damage numbers, no special animation, just a quiet, the attack missed, followed by a devastating counterattack. Competitive players quickly grew to resent these abilities. Battles that hinged on a single missed move felt arbitrary, especially in high stakes matches. Over time, the frustration grew so strong that entire clauses were written around it. Smogon's competitive rule sets introduced the evasion clause, banning abilities like Sand Veil and Snow Cloak when paired with permanent weather. Game Freak themselves seem to agree, quietly removing these abilities from official tournament legality in later generations. Despite the backlash, there's a certain charm to how these abilities reflect Pokemon's environmental themes. Sand Veil makes desert dwellers harder to see in a storm, and Snowcloak turns icy Pokemon into camouflaged predators. Mechanically frustrating, but thematically brilliant, they represent the tension between flavor and fairness, proof that sometimes too much realism in design can make a game feel downright cruel. If Sand Veil manipulates luck, then Repel manipulates probability, and it does so with elegant simplicity. On the surface, Repel is one of the most mundane items in Pokemon. It prevents wild Pokemon encounters for a set number of steps. But behind the scenes, it uses a hidden calculation that most players never realize, creating one of the earliest examples of invisible encounter filtering in gaming. When you use a Repel, the game doesn't simply turn off wild battles. Instead, it checks the level of the first Pokemon in your party against the encounter tables for that area. If your lead Pokemon's level is higher than the potential wild Pokemon in the grass, cave, or water, the game suppresses the encounter. If the wild Pokemon's level is equal or higher, you can still trigger a battle despite the Repel. This subtle mechanic gives players a quiet sense of control, a reward for keeping their team strong. The higher your lead Pokemon's level, the fewer interruptions you face, but it also allows for strategic manipulation. By carefully setting your lead's level just above the average encounter range, you can filter out weaker species while still finding rarer, higher level ones. In later generations, players used this to target specific wild Pokemon without external tools, turning Repel into a hidden scouting aid rather than just a convenience item. Interestingly, the game never tells you this. Repels are presented as simple consumables with a step limit, yet the internal level check adds depth and intentionality to what seems like a throwaway item. The design encourages exploration. Players who notice that certain Pokemon still appear might eventually piece together the logic themselves. In a series often accused of hand-holding, Repel remains one of Pokemon's most quietly clever mechanics. It's not about removing encounters, it's about earning peace through strength. It's the invisible hand of design, giving power to players who pay attention, one step at a time. Most players remember the tension of trying to flee from a wild encounter, the panic of being trapped by a Zubat or a Rattata that just won't let go. It feels random, like luck. But in truth, running from wild battles has never been purely chance-based. Since Generation Lost, Pokemon's escape mechanics have quietly relied on a mathematical formula built around speed, one that most players have never seen but have felt countless times. The formula compares your Pokemon's speed stat to that of the wild opponent, plugging those values into an equation that determines your chance of escaping. In the original red and blue, the odds of running away were calculated as run chance equals open parenthesis, player's speed times 32 close parenthesis divided by open parenthesis, wild Pokemon's speed divided by 4 plus 30 close parenthesis plus turn count times 30. What that means in practice is that faster Pokemon, or battles that drag on longer, make escaping much easier. The more turns you spend trying to flee, the higher your chances climb. So while it might feel like you're simply getting lucky on the third or fourth try, you're actually benefiting from an invisible system designed to gradually show mercy. But this formula also has a dark side. If your Pokemon is slower than the wild one, your odds of escape plummet. This made caves like Mount, Moon, or Victory Road particularly grueling, as under-leveled players were constantly punished for trying to run from faster wild Pokemon. Later generations refined this mechanic, simplifying the formula, but keeping its speed-based heart intact. It's a perfect example of Pokemon's design philosophy, the illusion of randomness masking a system of logic. Escaping a battle isn't about luck. It's about math, patience, and knowing when to fight or flee. If wild encounters are mathematical beneath the surface, then the Safari Zone is pure behavioral psychology. Unlike any other area in the series, Safari battles use their own hidden catch and flee formulas, systems so strange and opaque that even data miners took years to fully decode them. When you enter the Safari Zone, you're stripped of your Pokeballs and your control. Instead, you're given Safari Balls and 4 options: throw ball, throw bait, throw rock, or run. What looks like a mini game of chance is actually a tangled web of hidden variables. Every wild Pokemon in the Safari Zone has 2 hidden stats: catch rate and escape rate. These numbers interact with your actions in unpredictable ways. Throwing bait makes Pokemon less likely to run away, but it also lowers your chance of catching them, as they become harder to trap while distracted by food. Throwing a rock does the opposite. It makes them easier to catch by lowering their effective catch rate, but also enrages them, drastically increasing the odds they'll flee the next turn. This tug of war between risk and reward turns the Safari Zone into one of the most psychologically tense parts of the early Pokemon games. Players are forced to read invisible behaviors, making guesses about probability without feedback. The game never tells you how likely a Pokemon is to run or how effective your bait was. It's all intuition, superstition, and hope. Under the hood, each throw adjusts hidden modifiers, recalculated every turn. A Pokemon's decision to flee or stay is determined by its unique escape rate plus randomness, creating a constant sense of uncertainty. That's why a Chansey can escape after 1 rock, while a Paris might linger forever. It's not bad luck, it's coded temperament. The Safari Zone's brilliance lies in that illusion. It transforms a simple catching system into a nerve-wracking balance of psychology, probability, and patience. It's not just a battle of stats, it's a battle of restraint. And for players hunting rare creatures like Tauros, Kangaskhan, or Chansey, those few tense seconds before a Pokemon bolts away are some of the most memorable in the entire franchise. Among the most elusive encounters in Pokemon history are the roaming legendaries, creatures like Raikou, Entei, Latios, and Mesprit that wander the map after their initial release. Unlike static legendaries, waiting in caves or towers. These roamers move between routes after every battle or screen transition, appearing randomly in tall grass or even mid-travel. What most players don't realize, though, is that these Pokémon are bound by a hidden persistence mechanic that makes them feel alive and uniquely frustrating. When a roaming legendary first spawns, the game locks in its individual values, IVs, nature, and hit points, HP, permanently. This means that every time you encounter it afterward, it's the exact same Pokémon, same stats, same personality, even the same amount of health remaining from previous battles. If you manage to chip it down to low HPs and it flees, the next encounter will show that same damage carried over. This gives roamer hunting an almost narrative quality. Each encounter feels like a continuation of a single, ongoing struggle. However, that persistence also makes resetting for the perfect version a nightmare. Because the IVs and nature are set the moment the Pokémon begins roaming, not when you first encounter it. Players looking for the ideal competitive version must reset the game before the roaming sequence even begins. Later generations introduced new generation points, such as saving before releasing the roamer, to give players control, but the frustration lingered. It's a fascinating blend of realism and inconvenience. These legendaries truly roam, not just across the map, but across your save file's memory. Every time they flee, they take a piece of the battle with them, making the pursuit feel less like a static encounter and more like a living hunt. If roaming legendaries are defined by their permanence, then hidden power is defined by its variability, one of the strangest and most mathematically complex moves in Pokémon history. Introduced in Generation 2, Hidden Power is a special attack whose type and power are determined by the Pokémon's hidden IVAS, the genetic-like values that shape their potential. The genius of Hidden Power lies in how it converts these invisible numbers into an actual elemental identity. Each Pokémon has 6 IVS for HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed, and Hidden Power uses the least significant bits of those IVS to determine its type. The game runs these bits through a formula, mapping the result to one of the 16 elemental types, everything except fairy and normal. The result? A single move that could become almost any type: ice, grass, fire, electric, and beyond, depending entirely on your Pokémon's genetic makeup. Competitive players quickly turned this quirk into a cornerstone of strategy. A Jolteon with Hidden Power Ice could suddenly obliterate ground or dragon types. A Magneton with Hidden Power Fire could counter steel foes that would otherwise wall it completely. However, the system's beauty came with complexity. Breeding or RNG, manipulating for a specific hidden power type, required incredible precision, since even one off value in an IV could change the outcome. Later generations simplified the mechanic, fixing its power to 60 and eventually removing the move altogether in Sword and Shield. Despite its removal, Hidden Power remains one of Pokémon's most elegant examples of mechanical depth hidden behind apparent simplicity. It turned invisible data into visible power, proof that beneath every battle was a layer of unseen code waiting to be understood. For years, HP Ice wasn't just a move, it was a badge of mastery, known only to trainers who truly saw through the numbers. Catching Pokémon has always been an act of suspense, watching the Pokeball shake once, twice, maybe 3 times before it either clicks shut or bursts open. But hidden beneath that simple animation is a surprisingly intricate system of calculations, one that in later generations gave rise to a rare phenomenon known as the critical capture. First introduced in Generation 5, this mechanic added a subtle thrill to catching, a flash of speed and sound that signaled something special had just happened. Unlike a normal capture, which runs up to 4 internal shake checks to determine if the Pokemon breaks free, a critical capture runs just one. If that single check succeeds, the catch is instant. The ball locks immediately, skipping the usual drama. The odds of triggering one, however, depend on a hidden variable most players never consider: the number of Pokemon you've caught in your Pokedex. The more species you've captured, the higher your critical capture rate becomes. The game multiplies your normal catch chance by a factor that scales with your Pokedex progress, meaning completionists quietly enjoy a tangible reward for their efforts. In a way, it's Pokemon's version of a loyalty bonus, a system that acknowledges the dedication of those who catch them all. The mechanic isn't just cosmetic. Players who've filled their Pokedex notice the difference: catches that seem to lock in faster, often accompanied by a unique sound effect, a deeper clunk as the ball seals shut after a single wobble. It's both a reward and a subtle motivator, turning Pokedex progress into a source of real mechanical advantage. Critical captures transformed a familiar act into something magical, a reminder that even after hundreds of catches, the game still finds ways to surprise you. For completionists, that rare instant click feels less like luck and more like recognition, the game quietly saying, "You've earned this one." While critical captures reward collection, another hidden mechanic rewards preparation: the ability Synchronize, one of Pokemon's most quietly powerful tools for manipulating nature itself. Introduced in Generation 3, Synchronize's visible effect seems simple. When the Pokemon with this ability is inflicted with a major status condition, it passes that same condition to its attacker. But hidden beneath that is a second, far more strategic effect. When a Pokemon with Synchronize leads your party in the overworld, there's a 50% chance that any wild Pokemon you encounter will share its nature. This invisible influence has made Synchronize indispensable for competitive players and shiny hunters alike. Because a Pokemon's nature determines which stat grows faster and which grows slower, having control over it is vital for fine-tuning stats. For instance, a timid Alakazam with Synchronize can help you find other timid Pokemon, the nature best suited for speed-based attackers, cutting the randomness out of the process. What makes this mechanic so fascinating is how understated it is. The game never explains it. There's no dialogue or tutorial hinting that your lead's personality can shape the minds of wild creatures. And yet players who experiment long enough inevitably notice a pattern: wild Pokemon mirroring their lead's nature more often than coincidence should allow. That moment of realization feels almost supernatural, like your Pokemon's temperament is literally affecting the world around it. In gameplay terms, Synchronize is one of the few legal ways to bias wild encounters without external tools. In thematic terms, it's brilliant. It reinforces Pokemon's core idea that connection and harmony between trainer and partner extend beyond battles. Your Pokémon doesn't just fight for you, it shapes the very world you walk through. It's a mechanic that operates quietly, invisibly, and powerfully. The kind of system that reminds players that mastery in Pokémon often comes not from grinding, but from knowing what's hidden just beneath the surface. Few abilities in Pokémon are as deceptively adorable or as unexpectedly broken as Cute Charm. On the surface, it's a simple gimmick. When a Pokémon with this ability is hit by a move that makes physical contact, there's a chance the attacker will become infatuated, unable to attack half the time out of love. But in certain DS-era games, Cute Charm carried a hidden side effect that went far beyond romance, one that affected wild encounter gender ratios, and under very specific conditions, could even boost shiny odds to absurd levels. In Generation 4 and 5, Cute Charm altered how the game determined a wild Pokemon's gender. When the ability holder led the party, it applied a 66% chance that encountered Pokemon would be the opposite gender of the lead. That alone was a clever little trick, useful for finding specific genders in breeding or version exclusives. But the true strangeness came from how this system interacted with the game's personality value, PID, the hidden number that also determines whether a Pokemon is shiny. Due to the way the game's calculated gender and PID simultaneously, Cute Charm's gender skewing could force certain PID ranges to repeat more often. If a player's trainer ID and secret ID happened to align with these ranges, the result was astonishing. Shiny odds that jumped from 1 in 8,192, the normal rate, to around 1 in 21. That's not a typo. Under perfect conditions, the Cute Charm glitch made shinies hundreds of times more likely to appear. Once the community discovered it, players began deliberately exploiting it, manipulating IDZs to reproduce the effect. Nintendo later patched it out, but for a brief window in DS history, Cute Charm shinies became a kind of mythic event, a reminder that even the most innocent abilities could hide world-bending power beneath their sweetness. If Cute Charm's magic was hidden in math, then honey trees in Sinnoh were hidden in time and patience. Introduced in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, these golden-barked trees let players smear honey on them to attract wild Pokémon. After a 6-hour wait, real-world time, the tree would shake, signaling that a Pokémon had appeared. But what that Pokémon was, and whether it was even worth waiting for, depended on an invisible web of ID-based probabilities that turned the mechanic into one of the most quietly mysterious systems in the franchise. Here's the strange part. Not all honey trees are created equal. Out of the 21 trees scattered across Sinnoh, only 4 are designated as Munchlax trees, the only places where the elusive baby Snorlax can spawn. But these 4 aren't fixed. Their identities are determined by your trainer ID and secret ID, hidden numbers assigned when you start the game. The result? Every save file has a unique combination of 4 Munchlax trees, meaning no 2 players share the same locations. The catch rates on these trees are equally brutal. Even if you find your Munchlax designated trees, the odds of actually encountering one are a microscopic 1%, making it one of the hardest non-legendary Pokémon to obtain legitimately. Combine that with the 6-hour real-time wait, and you have one of the most punishing, obsessive systems ever designed in a Pokémon game. What's beautiful about the Honey Tree system, though, is how personal it feels. Each player's world hides its own tiny secret, its own pattern of trees tied to their identity as a trainer. It's Pokemon's way of saying, your world isn't just a Sinnoh, it's your Sinnoh. A little slower, a little luckier, and infinitely yours, if you're patient enough to wait for it to bloom. Among the most infamous Pokemon ever designed, Phoebus stands as both a meme and a masterpiece of hidden mechanics. Introduced in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, it quickly earned a reputation for being nearly impossible to find, not because of rarity alone, but because of the way the game secretly hid it within the waters of Hoenn. Unlike most Pokemon that spawn across entire areas or routes, Phoebus appears only on 6 random water tiles along Route 119 out of hundreds. The key word there is random. Each save file generates a seed that determines which 6 tiles contain Phoebus, and those tiles persist until the trendy phrase at Dewford Town changes, effectively refreshing the hidden pattern. In other words, your world has a unique Phoebus configuration, quietly rotating in sync with an in-game gossip system most players barely notice. This mechanic was intentionally cryptic. Developers at Game Freak later admitted they wanted Phoebus to feel like a community discovery, something so elusive that players would have to share coordinates, rumors, and luck to find it. And they were right. During the Game Boy Advance era, players flooded message boards trading coordinates, testing water tiles one by one with super rods, each encounter feeling like a miracle. Finding Phoebus was only half the challenge. To evolve it into the elegant melodic, you needed to max out its beauty condition, a hidden stat influenced by Pokeblocks and berries. That meant not only catching the rare fish, but raising it with care and strategy. Phoebus became a legend, not for its power, but for its patience. It embodied one of Pokemon's most enduring themes, that even the most overlooked creatures can transform into something extraordinary if you're willing to put in the work. If Phoebus represented the agony of randomness, then Pokemon breeding mechanics represented the gradual triumph over it. When breeding was first introduced in Generation 2, the process was simple but wildly unpredictable. Offspring inherited their species from the mother, a few moves from the parents, and everything else, including stats and nature, was left to chance. But over the generations, 2 key items, the Everstone and the Destiny Knot, transformed breeding from a game of luck into a science of control. The Everstone, first appearing in the 2nd generation, originally seemed like a mundane item that prevented evolution. But by Generation 3, it gained a hidden power. When held by a parent in the daycare, it passed down that parent's nature to the offspring. This was revolutionary. Natures directly affect stat growth. A timid nature boosts speed while lowering attack, for example, meaning the Everstone suddenly became an essential tool for building competitive teams. Then came the Destiny Knot in Generation 6, a simple accessory with enormous implications. Normally, a baby Pokemon inherited 3 of its 6 IVS, individual values, from its parents. The rest were random. The Destiny Knot changed that. When held, it ensured that 5 IVs were passed down instead of 3, dramatically improving the odds of producing perfect offspring. Combined with the Everstone, this created a system where players could shape both personality and genetics, the perfect fusion of strategy and patience. These mechanics redefined the entire competitive ecosystem. What once required hundreds of hours of random hatching became a deliberate, mathematical process. For the first time, trainers weren't just catching Pokémon, they were engineering them. Together, the Everstone and Destiny Knot turned breeding into a quiet form of mastery, proof that behind Pokemon's bright colors and childlike charm lies a world of invisible systems waiting for those who love to optimize the impossible. When Pokemon first introduced the concept of IVS, hidden genetic values that determine how strong each stat can become, they were meant to reflect individuality. But in competitive play, that individuality often became a curse. A single Pokemon with subpar IVs could be functionally useless against one with perfect stats. For years, players either bred endlessly to chase perfection or accepted imperfection as part of the game's randomness. Then Generation 7 arrived, bringing with it a quiet revolution: bottle caps, and the process known as hyper training. At first glance, bottle caps looked like yet another collectible trinket. But when given to a special NPC, they unlocked one of the most powerful features in Pokemon history. Hyper training allowed you to perfect a Pokemon's stats, boosting them to the equivalent of 31 IVOS, the theoretical maximum, without altering their genetic code. In other words, it didn't change the actual IV numbers stored in the Pokemon's data. It simply treated them as if they were perfect for battle calculations. This distinction mattered deeply. A Pokemon that was hyper-trained would perform identically to one bred with perfect IVS, but its actual IVSS remained the same under the surface. That meant its genetic imperfections still passed down if bred, a subtle but crucial difference that preserved the balance of the system. Hyper-training effectively ended the era of competitive gatekeeping. Players could now make any beloved Pokemon viable without grinding hundreds of eggs or relying on luck. A childhood favorite with poor stats could stand alongside flawless bred teams, not because its nature changed, but because its potential was finally unlocked. It was a brilliant compromise between accessibility and integrity, power through effort, not manipulation. The code stayed pure, but the dream of perfection was finally attainable. If bottle caps let players reshape a Pokemon's potential, then mints let them rewrite its temperament, at least in practice. Introduced in Generation 8, mints provided a long-requested feature: the ability to modify how a Pokemon's nature affected its stats without altering the nature itself. On paper, it sounds simple, but under the hood, it's one of the most elegant balancing acts Game Freak has ever designed. Traditionally, a Pokemon's nature was determined at birth and was immutable. Natures affect stat growth. For example, a modest nature increases special attack but lowers attack, while adamant does the opposite. Before mints, getting the right nature required tedious breeding or resetting until luck smiled. But with mints, that frustration vanished. So giving a Pokemon a mint doesn't literally rewrite its nature in the data. It simply changed the way the nature behaves for stat calculations. Here's where it gets fascinating. The original nature still exists in the code. You can even see it on the Pokemon's summary screen, unchanged. The mint just overrides its mechanical effect. That means for things like breeding, the unmodified nature is what gets passed down, not the minted one. In other words, your Pokemon may act like it's modest, but its DNA still says it's jolly. This subtle distinction preserves the illusion of control while keeping the genetic rules intact. It's a compromise that honors both the competitive scene's demand for flexibility and the purest logic of Pokemon genetics. For players, Mint's transformed team building from a grind into a creative process. No longer chained to chance, trainers could experiment freely, crafting new strategies and personalities for their favorites without starting over. It's one of those rare mechanics that feels like magic, invisible, practical, and quietly revolutionary, turning what was once a fixed part of a Pokemon's identity into something fluid, a reflection of a trainer's intent, not just the game's math. When Imposter Ditto was introduced in Generation 5, it turned one of Pokemon's simplest creatures into one of the most unpredictable. For years, Ditto had been little more than a breeding tool, a pink blob that could transform into any opponent, but too slow and fragile to use effectively in battle. Its signature move, Transform, required a turn to activate, leaving it exposed before it could adapt. But with the Imposter ability, that changed forever. Suddenly, Ditto became a living mirror, an instant copy of its foe, the moment it entered the field. The mechanic is deceptively simple, but astonishingly deep. When Ditto switches in, Imposter automatically activates Transform, copying the opponent's current stats, moves, typing, boosts, and form, everything except for one crucial detail. Its HP, Ditto keeps its own hit points, scaled to level, meaning even when it becomes a legendary powerhouse like Kyogre or Garchomp, it retains its frail health pool. That single limitation creates a fascinating tension. Ditto can become anything, but it remains fragile, forcing players to rely on timing and prediction rather than raw durability. Competitively, Imposter Ditto became one of the greatest equalizers in Pokemon history. Against setup sweepers, Pokemon that rely on stat boosts to dominate, Ditto acts as a perfect counter. When it copies a fully boosted opponent, it instantly gains those same boosts, turning the enemy's strength against them. A single switch can flip an entire battle. Even outside of competitive play, the ability embodies the philosophical beauty of Pokemon design. A weak, overlooked creature that adapts, reflects, and thrives by becoming what it faces. Imposter Ditto doesn't win through power, it wins through mimicry, proving that in a world of strategy and identity, sometimes imitation really is the highest form of mastery. If Ditto is the ultimate mimic of form, Zoroark is the ultimate mimic of perception. Its signature ability, Illusion, introduced in Generation 5, doesn't change what Zoroark is. It changes what you think it is. When Zoroark enters battle, it takes on the appearance, name, and Pokeball of the last healthy Pokemon in your party, tricking opponents into believing they're facing something entirely different. At first glance, Illusion seems like a simple gimmick, but its implications are psychological as much as mechanical. Pokemon battles, especially competitive ones, rely on prediction, choosing moves based on what you expect your opponent to do. Illusion weaponizes that expectation. If your opponent believes they're fighting, say, a Lucario, they might use a ground move, only to discover too late that they've just wasted a turn on a ghost-type Zoroark immune to it. However, the disguise isn't perfect. Zoroark's HP bar always reveals its true identity, subtly betraying the trick. Since the HP displayed corresponds to Zoroark's own stats, experienced players can spot inconsistencies. A Snorlax with surprisingly little HP, for instance, might raise suspicion. Additionally, the illusion breaks immediately when Zoroark takes direct damage or if certain field effects reveal discrepancies, like weather abilities not activating as expected. Despite these cracks, illusion remains one of the most creative and mind-bending mechanics in Pokémon history. It's not just about deception, it's about manipulation, misdirection, and reading your opponent like a book. In competitive circles, skilled players use it to bait out attacks, control tempo, and set traps, creating entire battles that play out like psychological chess. Illusion doesn't make Zoroark stronger by numbers. It makes it stronger through doubt. It turns information into a weapon, teaching players that in Pokémon, as in life, perception can be just as dangerous as reality. When it first appeared in Generation 5, the Eviolite seemed like a small, forgettable item, just another trinket among hundreds in Pokémon's growing inventory. But behind its simple description lay one of the most transformative mechanics the series had ever introduced. The Eviolite increases the defense and special defense of any Pokémon that can still evolve by 50%. On paper, that sounds straightforward. In practice, it rewrote the balance of the game. Suddenly, Pokémon long dismissed as weak or underdeveloped became powerful defensive forces. Creatures like Chansey, Dusclops, and Porygon 2, all of which stop evolving only with special items or conditions, could now rival, or even outclass, their fully evolved forms in raw durability. Chansey, for example, already had an enormous HP pool, but pairing it with Eviolite turned it into a wall so resilient that even legendary level attackers struggled to break through. The beauty of Eviolite lies in how it challenges assumptions. Pokémon evolution had always been portrayed as linear progress, evolve to grow stronger, faster, better. Eviolite flipped that logic completely. It made regression powerful, rewarding players who looked beyond appearances and saw potential in what others overlooked. From a design standpoint, it was also brilliant balance work. The item only works on Pokémon capable of evolving, meaning once you reach the final stage, the bonus disappears. That simple rule keeps the mechanic from breaking the game entirely, while opening a creative niche for incomplete Pokémon to thrive. Eviolite represents one of Pokémon's most poetic mechanics, a reminder that growth doesn't always mean transformation. Sometimes, staying unevolved is the key to survival, and in a world obsessed with evolution, that irony makes Eviolite one of the most fascinating items ever created. If Eviolite rewards defense through development potential, Shedinja takes the opposite path, absolute fragility balanced by divine protection. Born through one of the strangest mechanics in the series, Shedinja only appears when a Nincada evolves into Ninjask, while there's an empty slot in your party and a spare Pokeball in your bag. When this happens, a second Pokemon mysteriously appears, a hollow shell animated by something supernatural. It has 1 horsepower, not 1%, literally 1 point of health. Yet it cannot be harmed by most attacks. That paradox is thanks to its signature ability, Wonder Guard. This ability blocks all damage from moves that aren't super effective, meaning only attacks that hit Shedinja for double or quadruple damage can hurt it. Everything else, from Hyper Beam to Earthquake to Psychic, simply fails. It's an inversion of Pokémon logic. Instead of building endurance, Shedinja survives through perfection of immunity. This makes it one of the strangest and most delicate creatures in the series. Status effects like poison, burn, or entry hazards such as Stealth Rock can instantly defeat it, since those don't count as direct attacks. Weather conditions like sandstorms can also destroy it passively, but when handled carefully, Shedinja becomes an eerie, ghostly counter to entire teams, able to wall anything that lacks the right move coverage. Lore-wise, it's even more haunting. Its Pokédex entries describe it as the discarded husk of Nincada that somehow gained a soul, a body with an empty shell and no visible movement. Looking into the hole on its back, the entries worn, is said to steal your spirit. Shedinja isn't just a Pokémon, it's a riddle, a creature that shouldn't exist, surviving only by the precision of coding and the grace of immunity. In the grand story of Pokémon's mechanics, Shedinja stands as the ultimate contradiction. One hit point, infinite mystery. Among all the strange and chaotic moves in Pokémon history, Metronome might be the purest embodiment of randomness. Introduced all the way back in Generation 1, it allows a Pokémon to perform any move in the game, or at least, that's how it seems at first glance. In reality, the move's coding hides one of the most intricate and carefully maintained rule sets in the entire franchise, the move caller system. When Metronome is used, the game doesn't simply pick a random move from the list of thousands available. Instead, it consults a massive internal database that filters which moves it can and cannot call. Over time, this list has grown increasingly complex, evolving with each generation. Certain moves, like Struggle, Metronome itself, or Sketch, are hard-coded to be excluded, as allowing them could create infinite loops or break core mechanics. Others, like Transform or Focus Punch, are banned because they rely on unique battle states that can't always be replicated safely. Even within those rules, exceptions abound. Some moves behave differently depending on the generation. For example, Assist and Sleep Talk, other move callers, each maintain their own variations of the same rule set. Developers have had to constantly adjust these lists with every new Pokémon release, ensuring Metronome doesn't crash the game or summon impossible combinations. What makes it fascinating is that, despite all this structure, Metronome still feels like chaos. Watching a Togepi call Judgment or an Eevee use Draco Meteor captures the spirit of Pokémon's unpredictability. Underneath that moment of whimsy, though, lies one of the most carefully engineered systems in gaming, a delicate balance between total freedom and absolute control, ensuring that the magic of randomness never turns into real madness. At first glance, Protect seems like one of the simplest moves in Pokémon, a one-turn shield that blocks all effects. But like many simple mechanics in the series, it hides layers of complexity that most players never notice. Under the hood, Protect's interactions with multi-hit and status moves are anything but straightforward. When Protect is used, it normally prevents all direct attacks and effects for that turn. However, certain moves, like Double Kick, Bullet Seed, or Rock Blast, hit multiple times in one turn, each hit being treated as a separate attack in the game's logic. This means Protect must check each hit individually, rather than simply blocking the move as a whole. Under normal conditions, Protect blocks them all. But if certain timing effects, ability triggers, or turn order quirks intervene, stray hits can occasionally slip through. The same applies to status and secondary effects. Some moves, like Toxic or Will-O-Wisp, are fully blocked by Protect, but others with conditional or residual effects, for instance, Leech Seed, Future Sight, or even weather-based damage, can bypass it depending on when they resolve in the turn structure. Protect doesn't truly make a Pokémon invincible, it only covers specific phases of the action order. In doubles battles, these nuances become even more pronounced. Moves like Feint can deliberately break through Protect, while certain spread moves interact with it in ways that can leave one partner vulnerable even when the other is safe. The brilliance of Protect lies in its illusion of simplicity. It feels absolute, yet it's defined by boundaries and exceptions. The more you learn about how it truly works, the timing checks, hit resolutions, and coded priority layers, the more it transforms from a basic defense tool into a masterclass in battle programming. It's not just a shield, it's one of Pokemon's most quietly intricate systems of cause and effect. One of the most subtle and misunderstood quirks in Pokemon's battle system lies in something most players never consciously think about: integer rounding. Every calculation in a Pokemon battle, from damage dealt to experience gained, is based on math. But Pokemon doesn't use real numbers the way a calculator does. Instead, it uses integer math, meaning that whenever a result isn't a whole number, it's rounded down. That one tiny rule shapes the entire meta of the series in ways that can determine victory or defeat. Damage in Pokemon isn't a fixed value. It's determined by a formula involving a Pokemon's level, attack and defense stats, move power, and various modifiers like weather, items, and random variants. After all of that math is done, the final number is rounded down to the nearest whole integer. The result is that small differences in stats can have disproportionately large effects. A single point of extra attack or special attack might be the difference between a guaranteed 2-hit knockout, 2 HKO, and a frustrating 3-hit knockout, 3 HKO. Competitive players study these breakpoints obsessively because rounding truncates decimals instead of traditional rounding. Certain damage rolls cluster at thresholds that can make or break strategies. For example, boosting a stat by just 1 point may push your attack into a higher damage tier, enough to secure a KO that would otherwise require an extra turn. Conversely, defensive spreads are optimized to survive key attacks by a sliver of HP, thanks to the same rounding mechanics. Even more fascinating, this behavior extends to all calculations, from weather damage to leftovers recovery. The game always rounds down, creating subtle imbalances that players can exploit. It's a reminder that Pokemon's world isn't driven by pure randomness, but by math. A math that obeys the harsh, unyielding rules of integers, where fractions don't exist and every decimal lost can decide the outcome of a battle. Not all battles in Pokémon obey the same rules, especially when the story demands something cinematic. Throughout the series, some scripted or story encounters quietly override normal game mechanics, including catch rates, accuracy checks, or damage outcomes, to ensure the flow of the narrative. These hidden exceptions blur the line between player skill and developer intent, creating moments that feel epic without always being mathematically fair. One of the most famous examples comes from legendary Pokémon battles. Normally, legendary encounters follow standard catch rate formulas, complex equations that factor in the Pokemon's base rate, HP, and the Pokeball used. But certain scripted legendaries, such as the box mascots in more recent games, use modified or even guaranteed outcomes. In Pokemon Sun and Moon, for instance, the battle against Necrozma is technically unwinnable in early story segments. Its AI and damage output are tuned to ensure you lose. Later, the capture phase is set, so the game forces success after a certain attempt, regardless of probability. The same principle applies to events like starter captures or tutorial Pokemon. In these cases, the Pokeball always succeeds, even if the game still displays the animation of it shaking. Behind the scenes, the math is bypassed entirely. The script simply tells the game the player catches this Pokemon. Other instances are more subtle. Some NPC battles use forced hit checks, ensuring that key moves never miss or always land critical hits to emphasize story beats. Even certain totem Pokemon or boss encounters in later generations use special modifiers to make them more intimidating without breaking game balance. These exceptions remind players that Pokemon isn't just about probability, it's about storytelling. Beneath the formulas and damage rolls, the developers sometimes bend their own rules to craft an experience that feels legendary. For all its mathematical precision, Pokemon still makes room for magic, and that's what keeps the adventure unforgettable. When shiny Pokemon first appeared in Generation 2, their odds were so low that encountering one felt almost supernatural, a 1 in 8,192 chance, so rare that most players would go their entire lives without ever seeing one. But as the series evolved, so did the methods for improving those odds. Behind every sparkle lies a dense layer of math and probability management, where the game quietly checks rolls against invisible tables. Over time, developers introduced bonus rolls, techniques, and systems to make shinies more attainable, though never truly common. Modern Pokemon games use a base shiny rate of 1 in 4,096, but mechanics like chaining, Masuda breeding, SOS battles, and sandwich boost in Scarlet and Violet increase those odds, not by reducing the denominator, but by adding extra rolls for each encounter. Every roll is an independent chance to hit the shiny threshold. For instance, a chain combo in Let's Go Pikachu / Eevee, or a mass outbreak in Scarlet and Violet might add multiple shiny checks per spawn. The odds never technically drop below 1 out of 4,096 per roll, but with enough stacked rolls, the overall probability skyrockets. The cap on bonus rolls ensures that shinies remain special. Even with maximum boosts, shiny charm, perfect sandwiches, or chaining streaks, the game limits how many extra rolls you can earn, preventing shiny hunting from becoming trivial. Yet these systems strike a delicate balance between luck and persistence, rewarding effort without erasing the thrill of randomness. The community has turned shiny hunting into an art form, using math, patience, and probability manipulation to chase one of gaming's purest dopamine hits. The first glimmer, the spark, the unexpected flash of color, all of it happens because a hidden number generator finally, after thousands of rolls, lands in your favor. But what if randomness in Pokemon isn't as random as it seems? Beneath all the chance-based mechanics, critical hits, encounter tables, shiny rolls, lies one consistent truth. Pokemon's random number generator, ACE or NG, is deterministic. In other words, with the right information and timing, random outcomes can be predicted, manipulated, and even controlled. Pokemon games rely on seed-based RNG, meaning the game begins each session with a specific internal seed, a starting number that determines every random outcome thereafter. Each time the game needs to generate randomness for wild encounters, damage rolls, or shiny checks, it pulls from that seed using a formula. The result of one roll determines the next, creating a perfectly traceable chain of numbers. Speedrunners and data miners have learned to exploit this. By controlling inputs and timing, they can steer the RNG toward desired outcomes, a practice known as RNG manipulation or RNG abuse. In earlier generations, this was done by precisely timing when you started your game or triggered an encounter. Later, it evolved into frame-perfect systems where players could predict exact shiny Pokemon spawns, perfect IVS, or even egg outcomes. In modern titles, RNG is more complex and harder to control, but still ultimately deterministic. This deterministic randomness sits at the heart of Pokemon's design philosophy. It ensures that outcomes are reproducible and testable, a necessity for debugging and game balance, while still feeling unpredictable to players. To the casual trainer, a shiny encounter feels like fate. To a speedrunner, it's the result of precision and mastery. Pokemon's RNG perfectly embodies the series' paradox, a game that celebrates chance, built entirely on structure. Every random moment, every lucky crit, every impossible shiny is written in code from the moment you load the game. The magic isn't that it's random, it's that it feels like it is. And that's the beauty of Pokémon, a world that seems simple on the surface, but heeds layers of math, mystery, and invisible design choices that shape every battle, every capture, and every surprise moment of luck. From strange glitches in the Game Boy days to precision-engineered mechanics in the modern era, every generation adds new secrets for players to uncover. If you enjoyed exploring the hidden side of Pokémon, make sure to subscribe, because there are hundreds more mechanics, myths, and mysteries waiting just beneath the surface. The next time your Pokeball shakes, your attack misses, or your shiny finally appears, remember, in Pokémon, nothing is ever truly random.